These are some of the biggest changes in our lifetime.
The kind of definition of infrastructure has been expanded. Like, do you have a Westfield? Do you have a shopping centre? Do you have a strip of shops that would meet this criteria?
Yep, the change is now most of these stations, they're not going to get any shovels in the ground. No one's going to be building apartments in these areas just because you allow them to. A few months ago, we released one of our most popular episodes on Australian Property Talk. We talked through Sydney going through its biggest ever planning change on 1 April when the Transport-Oriented Development Plan was introduced in this city. A few months later, this policy, the first of its kind, a major change in Sydney, is about to get gazumped by an even bigger policy change that completely dwarfs the TOD alone in scale. The New South Wales government is serious about tackling the housing crisis and are fundamentally changing the design, the future, and the way we live and participate in this city. These are some of the biggest changes in our lifetime that are happening in 2024 alone. We are a matter of months away from the Midrise housing code kicking in, expected at the end of 2024. And in this episode, we're going to go through specifically what these changes are, why they're so big, and run through some of the questions and answers that you all have. Should you buy an apartment there? Should you buy a house there? How to take advantage of it? What is the opportunity? What can I do to benefit from these changes? How does it impact me? We're going to run through my understanding of all of this and share it all with you. Now, I should acknowledge and note, I'm definitely not the expert on this. We don't know exactly when these changes are going to happen, whether the format of them are going to be as designed, whether there's going to be changes, what the next month's council elections will do to these changes. There's so much uncertainty today, but we can share what we know with you to help you make some decisions and help you provide the answers to the questions that we are being asked regularly by clients all across Australia and particularly in Sydney. Curtis, how are you?
Yeah, going well. It's like, this is starting to be a common question now that we're getting asked. So yeah, like you say, we don't have all the answers, but there's a lot of change floating around. So it's kind of interesting to unpack it. Particularly, it feels like in the last 12 months, there's a lot of change that's in the immediate pipeline compared to like the decade preceding it. So
definitely. I've been tracking this sort of stuff for, the last 5 to 10 years pretty closely. And I think that's where a lot of the information design has been coming to us. We're mortgage brokers. We're not planning experts. We're not architects. We're just mortgage brokers who obviously have a slant to property investors and love talking property investing. And I specifically have more of a slant to Sydney-based property investing and planning-based property investing strategies. So that is likely where these questions are being asked of us. And, we're just following the data that comes to us. It is the most popular episode that we've ever done, or one of the most popular episodes. People want to know our thoughts on the investing side of things, along with the lending and economy side of things. So let's go into it. Let's just do this as a Q&A. And, I'll provide whatever answers to the questions that people are asking. And you've come up with a little bit of a script to the questions that people are asking us to, unpack it all. Rather than speaking to an individual, let's speak to everybody that listens and our community when we run through this.
Yeah, okay, let's start with the basics. So what is actually happening?
Yeah, so we have the introduction of what I call the Midrise housing code. There's so many different names for it, but what they're effectively trying to do is get more dwellings, more terrace-type dwellings, more duplexes, and more small to medium-rise apartment dwellings across the capital, so across Sydney, particularly around key transport hubs and key town centres. So think shopping centres.
Yep.
Think anywhere where you see a pretty dense sort of retail centre. It doesn't have to be a full shopping centre. Anything with a supermarket is kind of the definition that they've got here. Anything with a train station or a light rail station. Anywhere around these areas, the planners are saying that's where people should live. They should live near transport or near a shopping centre, not just out 70 kilometres out Western Sydney where you have to drive 3 kilometres to go to the nearest shopping centre or the nearest railway station. That planning strategy that we've had for decades and decades is changing, and they're like, hang on, we have all this existing infrastructure here. Let's get more people to live around it. As a really good example, there's this train station in inner South Sydney, 15 kilometres So 15 minutes to Sydney CBD, 5 minutes to Sydney Airport. In a landmass sense, it's pretty large. It has one apartment building. It has 1,000 residents and a whole train station servicing 1,076 homes. So it might have 2,000 residents, but 1,076 homes. That is pretty crazy where you have such bulk scale infrastructure to service,
with such low density. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's nothing, right? And I've just come back from Tokyo and Japan, and it's completely the opposite. You have 1,000 people inside like a small little circle regularly because the density that they have there for the population is much, much larger. And it just shows that Sydney is very much in its infancy. We're a baby little city. Like, that's just growing up a little bit, and it's like, let's go from this little baby form that we're in into, toddler form and get in a little bit more density to where people need to live. That's solution one to the housing crisis and getting more density in. So terraces, duplexes across the city, and mid-rise apartments, so 3, 4, 6 level apartment buildings in and around these key centers is what they are doing. And the reason why it's so big is how many train stations does Sydney have? Like, there's train stations everywhere. In almost every single suburb, or in most suburbs, there's train stations. And in the suburbs that don't have train stations, they have a shopping centre.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
I think that's the big change, or that's the key thing is like, okay, it's not just do you have a train station within a couple hundred meters or 500 meters. It's now, all right, the kind of definition of infrastructure has been expanded. Like, do you have a Westfield? Do you have a shopping centre? Do you have a strip of shops that would meet this criteria?
Yep.
And if yes, then they're like, all right, we want to see some higher density around those areas.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And they're kind of changing the definition of what a standard home should be in Sydney. So in the past, standard home, quarter acre block, white picket fence. That's the typical notion of what Sydney is like. That's a previous 1990s sort of era viewpoint of what Sydney looks like. Now, fast forward to the year 2050. It'll take a lot of time to realize all of this. What will Sydney look like? It's going to look like a lot of small to medium rise type dwellings. So think Paddington as a really good example. Think Wallara. Think inner city areas. Alexandria, another one. These areas that people have gone through. That is the type of density that they want applied everywhere. They don't want that to be in the inner city suburbs. They want that to be across every train station. When you go out to Revesby or Bankstown or, Panania or, out to Campbelltown, out to Blacktown, out near Mount Druitt, wherever you go, you see these big detached homes with, 500,000 square meter blocks where one family lives. Sometimes just one old person lives or one young person lives. They're changing that to being like, actually, why don't we get, apartments there or terraces there and allow the zoning to allow for that to get the people in. So it's a fundamental change to the way Sydney will look over time. The change is now, which means that the dwellings will come over the next few years, but it will take decades to materialize. And the change that's creating this bigger wide-scale change for Sydney is this planning instrument that's going to be announced very, very soon.
Yeah. So do you want to unpack in a little bit more detail? Because there's like terraces, duplexes, apartments. There's some different dwelling types there.
Yes.
So how do they fit locationally from this change?
Yes. So the way that they plan on doing it, so if you have an R3 lot, so this is a medium density zoning, I think that's what R3 specifically means. So R3 is a type of zoning in Sydney that just allows for a bit more than R2, which is low-rise residential. In those R3 pockets near train stations, currently, depending on which council you're at, you may be allowed to do, a duplex or a small terrace type dwelling, and you get like a 0.5, 0.6 FSR floor space ratio. Now they're changing that to what the talk is it's going to rise to an apartment site to 4 to 6 levels, depending on how close you are to this key infrastructure that's there. If you're close, 6 levels. If you're more than 400, if you're between 400 and 800 meters away, it'll be 3, 4 levels, and it'll be apartments that can be put on that site. So you can fit more people onto that same block of land. Now, apartments cost a lot of money to build, and they don't sell for very much in many locations across Sydney. So this zoning change is not going to really
put immediate shovels in the ground.
It's going to put no shovels in the ground in pretty much 90% of Sydney.
Yeah.
Our math, or my math, this is my back of the envelope math is if you really want something to work across pretty much every R3 type property that is large enough, it can't be 250 square meters. It's pretty hard to put an apartment there, but 400 square meter plus with the right type of land lot. You can't have, there's lots of land lots that just aren't developable, but for the right type of land lot, if the per square meter cost of an apartment is above 15,000, then the numbers will start to work for that feasibility to happen, depending on the land price.
Yeah.
If land prices are in the millions, then it won't work. Anything below 15,000, it becomes a little bit tricky. Or 12,000 is really the number where it's just like, how's this going to work? The reason why I come up with that number is it costs roughly 6,000 per square meter to build an apartment dwelling. I'm making that number up. I'm just making it up out of thin air. But somewhere in that vicinity, it'll be between 4 to 7, 8, 9, 10,000, depending on the fixtures and fittings. So use 6,000 as a real back of the envelope sort of figure there. Now, that's just the build cost. Insurance costs to build an apartment is it's nearly 10% now. So that's another, $500-$600 per square meter for each apartment. That's just to insure the building against things. So you have and then there's planning costs, there's engineering costs, there's interest costs, there's holding costs, there's stamp duties, there's council contributions, there's taxes, and then there's the land. Yeah. So you put all that together and it's just you need to be selling these apartments almost in the 7-figure range to actually make it work. So they've introduced this transport-oriented development plan across Sydney, across all these key infrastructure pockets already, and they've identified a whole number of stations. Now, most of these stations, they're not going to get any shovels in the ground. No one's going to be building apartments in these areas just because you allow them to. If you can't do it in fairly inner sort of areas across Sydney, how are you going to do it in outer western areas where apartments sell for 20-30% less? So then this zoning change isn't going to actually put shovels in the ground straight away, but it will create the planning instrument for the next cycle of the housing market when apartments do cost more and when build costs flatline to potentially build this down the line. So that's the major change with apartments.
Yeah. Yeah. And that feasibility will move over time, right? And that's, I think, kind of one of the policy designs of this is okay, the feasibilities as the population of Sydney grows and grows and grows, the feasibilities for some of those areas that currently make no sense and there's no incentive to actually build now, in 20 years, they might stack up. And hopefully the planning instrument is there to go, okay, as that does occur, there should be a bit of a natural inclination to take on those developments and add that housing stock. So hopefully it self-balances a little bit from the government's perspective rather than having to have another big fight to push a planning change through. I can imagine that's kind of their Goldilocks of how they're thinking about it.
Yeah, it actually brings to point a couple of interesting intricacies or points of how it's actually going to play on the ground. This state government talks a lot about they want the east and these areas that are already established to do more to the housing crisis and add more housing supply. It's going to incidentally happen because this zoning change only allows people to be building apartments in these higher priced areas. Out west, just because you're allowed
don't stack up.
six levels in Liverpool, no one's going to be building apartments for 650,000 when they sell them at 500,000. Yeah. Feasibility doesn't stack up. No one's going to be building apartments even if you're allowed to do them. They'll be I'd rather build a duplex. That's better.
If you're on the
home.
Wallara side of Bondi Junction,
people will build it. So oddly enough, perhaps this is a little bit by design in the sense that it will get more density in these areas and a little bit more swallowable type density. People on that side of Wallara will probably feel a bit more comfortable with being okay, we can accept 6-level apartments because we're Wallara and we're used to seeing a lot of density. We already have terraces. We already have a few high-rises around us. So, we're going to see more 6-level apartments in these areas, but you're not going to see it everywhere. So that's one little impact that's there. The second impact that I have here is I'm not so sure the feasibility will stack up. If it doesn't stack up now, why will it stack up in the future? This is a concept that a lot of people talk about, and it is a little bit of just made up math, hope, I guess.
Hope. Well, I assume
construction costs rise.
Yeah, your back of the envelope calculation is that the demand for housing, which I would just proxy as population increase, is going to rise faster than construction costs.
So what if we just looked at fast start on that?
If that's true, then more things will come into the scope of feasibility. But it could, if the reverse happens, then less things will come in. But that would have to be how the math plays out, one way or the other.
Exactly. an even better calc, that is exactly how it's done, but an even better calc is the median value of an apartment or a median value of a new apartment per square meter.
Yep.
Now, call
compared to
domain
construction costs. Yeah.
compared to construction costs. What is the rise in both of them? Now, if you go back over the past 20 years, you'd think that apartment prices have risen a lot, and they have. They have done fairly well. The cost of construction has outpaced the rise in apartment values over an extended period of time now. Reason is, when you look at past values of construction costs, they rise over time.
Yeah, of course,
So, and they've been rising above the inflation level for an extended period of time in terms of the actual rate of growth in construction costs. So I'm not so sure. And it not only needs to catch up, it needs to overtake it and then come up with the profit margins to make it work.
Yeah, no, it needs to grow faster.
Yeah, it needs to grow faster for a long period of time to match up. So I'm not sure it's going to work, which then creates another problem. So this is a future problem. This is going to get housing density in the premium areas, which is good, which is where people want to live.
Yeah.
It's a start, but it's not going to solve affordability because it's not going to create all that much more dwellings or apartments in Western Sydney where you can buy $300,000-$400,000 apartments. It would be good if we can build more of those because that provides affordable housing to people on normal incomes versus, an apartment in.
Well, I would argue, if
Woollahra.
anything, the feasibility implies an increase in prices in order for it to actually work. So, like, if you're pushing prices down, then the feasibilities actually don't work, right? So, like, the construction never starts. So, in order for the spades to go into the ground, there actually has to be price rises in the sale costs. Like the sale price has to be higher to actually get the project off the ground. So
we talked about this in our last podcast. We said that in one of our last podcasts, we said that apartment values are good future proxies because no one can build them. No one can build apartments out Western Sydney. You know what that means?
Yeah.
It means if you own an apartment in these areas that's old or a nice big block of land, there ain't any more coming. Just because they say they're coming, it ain't coming because no one's going to build it, which means you're sitting on product that becomes more and more in demand over time, and there's a lack of supply just because zoning allows for it. It's not going to come. So that's an interesting
If you had a spreadsheet in enough time, there's actually an implied house price growth number that is like in these changes.
It's true.
That the government would have. Yeah.
But this is the one additional layer that I was going to throw into this is they'll work this out. They'll work it out in 5 years. The data will come in line and be like, why is Woollahra building? Why is no one building an apartment out in Liverpool? You know what they're going to do? They're going to be like, oops, we got our planning instruments wrong, which is something that I talked about earlier, being like, look, this is a great idea. The concept is really good. The solution that they have is too uniform. You can't have this same solution out in Liverpool as in Rockdale, as in the northern parts of Sydney and in Woollahra. It might work in Woollahra, but it doesn't work in Liverpool and Blacktown.
Yeah,
so
the feasibilities are too different.
You need to go higher. You need to allow, and also it's a bit dumb. Like, do we want Sydney to look identical everywhere? Being like, come on, like just allow some high density stuff. Liverpool has got a lot of towers there. Parramatta's got towers everywhere. So you need to do what's called a master planning sort of approach. And the state government's already onto this. They've picked, 12 different areas and are master planning them. And in those master plans, they've got 30 level dwellings, not 6, being like, this is not going to work. Let's make it 30. And once you go up there, all the developers are like, thank you, I can build 5 of these for 1 land cost. And now the numbers stack up. So that's another way to solve it. So that's a very, very interesting perspective with apartments. And the message to give to investors here is just because it's getting rezoned, it doesn't mean more supply is coming to where you live, particularly from 95% of Sydney, and in areas where the median value of a 2-bedroom apartment, a new 2-bedroom apartment, is under $1 million, probably doesn't stack up.
Yeah. So like you say, for people that already have their owner occupier in these areas, that's probably a good back of the envelope calculation to be like, hey, do I need to be concerned about immediate construction starting around me that's going to annoy me? Because that's a question we get a little bit.
Yes.
It's not going to be everywhere. Like you say, it's going to be those pockets where the apartment prices are higher. That's where the real incentive is for developers to come in, buy these lots, and like develop as straight away, basically.
Yep, exactly. I'm going to pass some on the ground intel here as well. So, we talk a lot about this, and a lot of our knowledge from this comes from the trying to make something happen, like a deal happen for myself, or looking at an investment opportunity and unpacking the numbers and exploring it, looking at different sites, getting into the detail with individual purchase acquisitions and running through the process. So that is where a lot of our intel comes from, because when you do that, you do a lot of due diligence on sites, you find out what apartments cost for, you find out what the market is doing. There is some activity happening in premium areas targeting these sort of locations. People have worked this out. Maybe even insto levels. Holding costs on a property like this, if you just do the math here, you're buying a 500 square meter apartment in an area, land parcel in rich areas. The holding cost on these is in the hundreds of thousands, in the multi-hundreds of thousands. So you're probably ruling out all mum and dad investors now, right? So it's now becoming a play for the wealthy who can accept really large holding costs. There is a little bit of activity happening there. You can kind of see it in like the very odd sites that pop up where it's just like, this one kind of works. Be like, whoa, it sold a bit higher than you'd expect, higher than owner-occupier price points. Now, this price level change will materialize more when you actually have the zoning change kick in. And that probably leads to our next question, which is, when does it kick in? It was supposed to start 1 July 2024, which, we're 2 or 3 months past, but we have council elections, is it this weekend or the next weekend? And it all got delayed, partly because of this. Councillors don't want this to happen just before they go and everyone votes for them. So the councils have managed to push this back a little bit, and they're negotiating what the key town centres are, what shopping centres are included, what areas should happen, what areas they want to do master planning for. They negotiate. There's obviously so much to do with this level of change. They're negotiating all of this through at the moment. And now the expectation is the end of 2024. And the reason why it's so quick, this is such a big planning change, but they're still rushing it through, is because we're in that 5-year window now, in the housing accord window, where the government wants to build 1.2 million homes in this 5-year window. We've started that window. We're month 3 into that window, which means we need to be building 240,000 homes per year, which means we need approvals at around 270,000 homes, about 90% of homes that are approved. Start at some point in the next few years. So whether that number holds, I don't know. That's the past. I think it'll fall down to about 80 because feasibility is now no longer stacked. But let's just keep that 90% figure, which means we need to approve 270,000 homes. We just had a huge month-on-month increase in approvals this month, the first month. Perhaps it's the Todd things that are happening. It's gone from 160,000 to 164,000. We are 100,000 approvals short at the moment of achieving this target. So nationally, we are miles away from this target, miles away, like not even close to solving it. And it's just a pipe dream policy making target that they've got that won't be met. And all these bonus targets that they've offered.
All the cash that they've offered the state governments.
Oops, we ain't going to meet this. So perhaps the states will work this out and be like, Western Sydney, actually, that 6th level, let's make it 30. Go build, please. So I think there might be even increased momentum because now there's cash on the table, which is something we talked about in the previous pod as well. Let's wrap this one up and then do the terrace and duplex one in a separate podcast, because that one impacts
more people.
And it's for the broader audience and it's for anyone who owns those sort of properties. We'll unpack that in our next episode and go through what duplexes and terraces are and how this is the opportunity for mum and dad investors because it's everywhere. And I'm going to run through my own personal stories of how I've done pretty well investing in this exact change that happened in 2020. And now the same policy toolkit is being applied in 2024 and how you can do the same.